The airport buzzed with the familiar rhythm of motion, heels clicking across polished tile, murmured gate announcements, the dull whir of suitcase wheels pulled in 1,000 directions. Amid the noise and motion, Danielle Pierce moved with quiet grace, her presence unshaken by the chaos. Clad in a charcoal blazer over a crisp ivory blouse, her posture poised and dignified, Danielle waited patiently in line at the airline service counter. She held a leather carry-on in one hand, a slim phone in the other, and the kind of calm that made her stand out. Not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. Her flight to Seattle wasn't for another 2 hours. But after 4 back-to-back meetings and a sleepless night in a hotel that smelled faintly of old carpet and corporate coffee, she'd hoped to upgrade to first class. Not as a luxury, just a moment of breathing room before the next wave of responsibility met her on the West Coast. When her turn came, she stepped forward with a soft, "Good afternoon," and offered a smile to the 2 employees behind the desk. One was a young woman named Sarah, who barely glanced up from her screen. The other, a lanky man with perfectly gelled hair named Kyle, leaned lazily on the counter with the air of someone bored with the world. Danielle's voice was warm but professional. "I was wondering if there were any first-class upgrades available for Flight 172 to Seattle." She slid her ticket across the desk with practiced ease. Sarah's eyes flicked down at it, then up at Danielle, hovering a second too long. Her lips twitched, not into a smile but something closer to disbelief. Kyle chuckled under his breath, tapping the keyboard without urgency. "First class?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow as though the request itself were laughable. "That's going to be, well, let's just say it's not cheap, ma'am." His voice stretched out the word ma'am like it was a joke shared between him and Sarah. Danielle blinked slowly, her expression unchanged, but her spine straightened by a fraction. "I'm aware of the pricing," she said, her voice calm. "I'd still like to check availability." Sarah and Kyle exchanged a glance, quick but unmistakable. It was the kind of look people gave when they believed they were in on something, when they thought they knew more than they did. Danielle knew that look. She'd seen it in meetings where her ideas were dismissed until repeated by someone else, in lobbies where she'd been mistaken for the assistant, in restaurants where she'd been ignored until the man at the table spoke up. And now here it was again. At a counter where she had said nothing to deserve the judgment beyond existing in a place where they didn't expect her to belong. Sarah leaned on one elbow, her voice falsely sweet. "We usually don't see requests like this for first class unless it's pre-booked or elite status. Just being honest." Danielle didn't flinch, but inside something pressed against her ribs. A subtle ache, an old bruise. "I do have elite status," she said, her tone unchanging. "And I'm not asking for charity, just availability." Kyle smirked, feigning interest in the screen. Sure, just don't want you to be shocked by the numbers. It's a lot of legroom for a lot of money." Sarah stifled a laugh. "Yeah, and the wine's not free unless you're in the real club." The last word dripped with something unspoken, something small and cruel. Danielle didn't respond, not at first. Her silence stretched just long enough to make them uneasy. She looked at Kyle, then Sarah, her expression unreadable. And then, quietly, she said, "I didn't ask for your commentary. I asked about the upgrade." Her voice, low and even, cut through their smugness like glass through fog. Kyle shifted slightly, his posture stiffening. Sarah's fingers tapped nervously on the desk. But before either could speak, another voice, flat, amused, said just loud enough to carry, "You people really love asking for things you can't afford, huh?" Danielle didn't need to ask which one of them had said it. It didn't matter. The words hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. "You people," as if she didn't know exactly what they meant. Danielle's fingers tightened around the handle of her carry-on. Her throat burned, not with tears, but with rage tempered by years of practice. She could have exploded. She had every right to, but she wouldn't. That would have given them exactly what they expected. She would not be their spectacle. Not today, not ever. Behind her, the line grew quiet. A woman in a floral scarf frowned. A man holding a baby leaned forward slightly, his expression hard. Even strangers could see it now, see the venom hidden in the softest of tones. Danielle didn't move. Not yet. She let the silence weigh on the air, let it settle around Sarah and Kyle like fog before a storm. She had learned long ago that dignity was a weapon of its own kind, That poise, when wielded with precision, could shame a room faster than fury. "I see," Danielle said at last, her voice still smooth. "Thank you." She picked up her ticket, slid it back into her wallet, and stepped aside. Not defeated, just done for now. Sarah laughed nervously, already pivoting to the next passenger, but her hands fumbled on the keyboard. Kyle's eyes darted toward the watching crowd. Danielle didn't look back. She walked away with the same grace she'd arrived with, measured, calm, and fully aware that their arrogance had revealed far more about them than her. 10 minutes, she thought, that's all it would take. Just 10 minutes, and the world they thought they understood would fall quietly, completely apart. Danielle Pierce stood to the side of the service desk, her small leather carry-on resting at her feet, the smug laughter of Kyle and Sarah still echoing faintly behind her like an old, familiar ache. Around her, the air in the terminal shifted, subtle but unmistakable. People had started to notice. Passengers who moments ago were buried in phones and boarding passes now looked up with quiet interest. They'd seen what happened. They'd heard the words, "You people," and not everyone can afford first class. And they saw how Danielle had not flinched, not cracked, not allowed even a sliver of fury to escape. She was still, composed. But inside, her chest burned, not with helplessness, but with a controlled, precise fire. She had learned over a lifetime that some battles weren't won by volume. They were won with patience and presence. And now it was time to act. She reached slowly into the inner pocket of her blazer and withdrew her phone, not dramatically, not to draw attention, but with the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was. Her thumb moved quickly across the screen, tapping into her contacts, finding the name she kept near the top, Martin West, Executive Director. One tap, two rings. He answered on the third. "Pierce," came the voice on the other end, brisk and respectful. "Is everything all right?" Danielle's tone was calm, measured, but every syllable carried a weight that made even the noisy terminal seem to fall quiet. "I'm at Gate 18, main terminal. I've just had an interaction with two of your employees at the counter," she said. "I'll need you to send someone from leadership down here immediately. There's a personnel matter that cannot wait." A pause, then Martin replied, "Understood. I'll be there myself in 10. Danielle ended the call, tucking the phone back into her pocket with a graceful finality, then folded her hands lightly in front of her. She didn't storm off. She didn't argue. She simply waited, because she knew what was coming, and so did we. If you've ever been dismissed before a word left your lips, if you've ever felt the sting of being underestimated simply for existing in a place someone else decided you didn't belong, you know that this moment wasn't about revenge. It was about reminder, a reminder of who she was, a reminder that dignity has a spine, and justice doesn't always need to shout. Kyle and Sarah returned their attention to the next customer, but their movements were suddenly stiffer, their banter quieter. Something in the air had shifted, and even they could feel it now. They didn't yet know why they were uneasy. They didn't yet know who Danielle Pierce really was. But they would. The clock ticked forward. 5 minutes passed, then 7. The passengers around the counter remained unusually quiet, their glances flickering toward Danielle, toward the service desk, toward the gate. Even strangers, it seemed, could sense that something unspoken was building, something bigger than an upgrade. At minute 9, a murmur began to ripple through the crowd. It began with the sudden stillness of two flight attendants standing by a boarding gate, then spread as a tall man in a tailored navy blue suit entered the terminal at a brisk pace, flanked by two associates in corporate attire. His badge shone silver at his chest, and his eyes were locked on a single person, Danielle. She turned to meet him before he could even speak. "Mr. West," she said with a nod, "thank you for your quick response." "Always, Ms. Pierce," he said, his voice lower now, laced with the realization that this moment was not only critical, it was public. He turned his head slightly toward the desk. "These are the employees?" Danielle didn't have to answer. Kyle had gone pale. Sarah had dropped her pen. The casual smirks had vanished, replaced by stunned, blinking silence. It was as though they were watching a stage curtain drop to reveal the real scene they were cast into, a scene they never auditioned for but were now squarely at the center of. "Wait," Kyle whispered, his voice cracking. Who is she?" But the question came too late. The crowd now leaned in slightly. Everyone was watching. Everyone needed to know. Mr. West turned toward Kyle and Sarah, and the tone of his voice changed. This is Mr. Danielle Pierce, our new strategic equity partner and the largest private stakeholder in this airline's leadership council, he said with deliberate precision. She is not just a valued passenger. She is one of the reasons you are standing behind that desk today. Gasps followed, actual gasps. Kyle's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like he was trying to catch a sentence before it betrayed him. Sarah looked down at her hands, her breath shallow, her eyes brimming with disbelief. Danielle said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence, calm and radiant, said more than Ray's voices ever could. Mr. West cleared his throat. Ms. Pierce, would you like to handle this directly or shall I? She looked at him for a moment, then turned her eye to the now ashen faces of Kyle and Sarah. Her voice when she spoke was soft, but it sliced clean. I came here today asking for professionalism. I was met with mockery, with assumption, with open disrespect. She let that hang, then added, not because of anything I said, but because of everything you thought you saw. Sarah whispered, I didn't mean, but you did, Danielle cut in, gently. You meant every word. That's the problem. She nodded toward Mr. West. I expect a full review, and I expect it to begin now. He nodded solemnly. Consider it done. And just like that, the world shifted. Not because Danielle raised her voice, but because she owned it. Not because she demanded fear, but because she commanded respect. And if you're still listening, if your heart is pounding and your stomach is tight, maybe it's because you know what it's like to be told, without being told, that you don't belong. But let this story remind you, your worth doesn't shrink when others fail to see it. And when you move with dignity, the world eventually has no choice but to rise to meet you. So stay with us, because what happens next is the moment justice lands. 10 minutes pass, though for Danielle Pierce, it felt like 10 hours, each second heavy with the weight of restraint. She stood off to the side of the airline service desk, her calm unshaken, but beneath her stillness simmered an ache only she could feel. Not just from this moment, but from the thousand like it that had come before. Mockery disguised as policy. Disrespect wrapped in plastic smiles. And now, here again, dismissed, doubted, and reduced. Passengers had begun to murmur, sensing the air shift. They watched her with a mixture of curiosity and concern, whispering quietly, stealing glances not just at Danielle, but at the two employees still seated behind the desk. Kyle, whose smirk had finally faltered, and Sarah, who now avoided eye contact altogether. But what none of them knew was that Danielle's morning had started long before this gate, in a nearby hotel conference room, where she had sat quietly through a breakfast meeting to honor a young woman, Renee, one of Danielle's former interns, who had been posthumously awarded a scholarship after losing her life to a rare form of cancer. Danielle had mentored her closely, helping her land her first job, writing recommendation letters when Renee doubted herself, and holding her hand through chemotherapy appointments when her own parents couldn't make it. The girl had died just 3 weeks before, and the ceremony had been Danielle's way of saying goodbye. Her eyes were still sore from holding back tears when she arrived at the airport, hoping, just hoping for one small ounce of ease. And instead, she had been humiliated by two people who didn't see her grief, her dignity, or her humanity, only what they assumed she couldn't be. So when the first click of polished dress shoes echoed through the terminal, Danielle didn't flinch. She simply turned toward the sound, her expression unreadable, as three sharply dressed individuals emerged from the security corridor. At their center was Martin West, regional director of the airline, and one of the most respected executives in the company's leadership team. He moved quickly, his navy suit catching the light, his brow furrowed with concern. Passengers turned as he passed, conversations halting. Kyle straightened in his seat. Sarah stood abruptly. They recognized him instantly. But it was what happened next that drained the color from both their faces. Ms. Pierce, Martin said, arriving at her side. He didn't nod. He didn't offer a hand. He gave a full bow of his head, the kind reserved for someone who commanded both reverence and apology. I came as soon as I heard. I'm so sorry this happened under our roof. His voice carried just far enough to make sure those who had witnessed the earlier exchange understood that something was different about this woman. Something important. Something they had missed. Danielle met his eyes. Thank you for coming, she said evenly, her voice soft but laced with iron. The issue is standing behind that counter. Martin turned then, slowly toward Kyle and Sarah, whose wide-eyed stares betrayed their unraveling confidence. Mr. Kessler, Ms. James, he said, addressing them by name. This is Danielle Pierce, executive partner, senior diversity strategist, and founder of the very equity board that reviews all frontline conduct. Kyle's mouth parted, soundless. Sarah took a half step back. She is one of the primary architects behind the culture initiative that signs your checks, Martin continued. And the fact that she was mocked, doubted, and humiliated by you in front of passengers is not only disgraceful, it is directly in violation of the very training you were required to complete. A man in the crowd audibly muttered, "Unbelievable." Another woman with a toddler at her hip shook her head, and suddenly the full weight of the moment began to settle on every bystander. Danielle wasn't just someone important. She was the person whose work was supposed to prevent exactly what had just happened. She was the reform they had ignored. Kyle stammered, "We didn't know." "You didn't ask," Danielle replied, her voice silencing the terminal. "You looked at me and you made a decision about what I was worth. Not because I said something offensive, not because I behaved unreasonably, but because in your mind I didn't look like someone who belonged in first class." Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat. Danielle took a single step closer, not intimidating, not loud, but undeniable. "I buried someone I mentored this morning," she said, her voice thickening slightly with emotion. "A woman who looked just like me. A woman who struggled every day to believe she was enough. I walked in here hoping for a moment of ease. And you," she paused, her voice catching, "you decided to laugh." Her words hung like thunder. Martin turned to Kyle and Sarah, effective immediately, and he said, "Both of you are relieved of duty pending formal review. HR has been notified." Security stepped forward. Kyle looked at Danielle, his bravado gone, his face pale with shame. Sarah, tearful, tried to speak, but Danielle raised a hand gently. "Let this be a lesson," she said. "Assumption is not harmless. It's a decision with weight. And today that weight has consequences." As they were escorted away, the passengers began to clap. Not loud or showy, but a steady, quiet rhythm of respect. It wasn't celebration. It was recognition. Danielle didn't smile. She nodded politely, then turned to Martin. "Now," she said calmly, "about that upgrade." "Of course," he replied, voice full of reverence. "Seat 1A is yours." And as Danielle walked toward the gate, her head held high, the crowd parted not in fear, but in awe. Because they had seen what happens when grace meets fire, and they would never forget her name. Mr. Lewis stood frozen for a breath, his eyes flicking from Rachel Monroe's calm, unflinching expression to the now silent desk where Amanda and Jason were still stationed, like statues caught in the act of their own undoing. The terminal, once filled with idle chatter and the rustling movements of travelers, had shifted into a charged stillness. Passengers nearby had stopped pretending not to watch. They leaned in subtly, sensing the weight of something rare unfolding. Not drama, but justice. Rachel stepped forward slowly, heels tapping against the polished tile with quiet authority. Each step purposeful, unwavering. "The issue is simple," she said, her voice smooth and clear, slicing through the air like a blade cloaked in silk. "Two employees who represent this airline mocked, belittled, and dismissed a paying customer based solely on their assumptions. They laughed at me. They spoke down to me. They made it clear I did not belong until they realized who I was." Jason opened his mouth, his face now drained of all color, the smugness replaced with pale confusion. "Miss Monroe, I didn't realize." "Exactly," Rachel interrupted, holding up a hand, her tone unbothered but firm. "You didn't realize because you didn't care to. Because your default response to someone who doesn't fit your narrow expectation of first class is mockery and arrogance." Amanda looked like she'd swallowed broken glass. "It was just a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice trembling. "We didn't mean any harm." Rachel turned to face her fully, her gaze sharp but not cruel. "You didn't mean harm, but you meant disrespect, and you thought that wouldn't have consequences." She looked over at Mr. Lewis, whose posture had stiffened, his jaw tight. "You told me you wanted to address this," she said. "Here's your opportunity to show you this company takes integrity seriously." Mr. Lewis gave a curt nod. Amanda, Jason, he said, his voice hardening, please step out from behind the desk. Amanda's eyes widened in panic. Jason's mouth opened again. A protest caught in his throat. Wait, sir, this is all just... Now, Mr. Lewis said, the finality in his tone silencing any rebuttal. Amanda stepped out first, her hands trembling. Jason followed, his tie askew, his earlier confidence evaporated. Two uniformed members of airport security approached from the side, summoned discreetly but arriving with unmistakable intent. They stood at a respectful distance, yet their presence was undeniable. Mr. Lewis looked to Rachel. Miss Monroe, I'll personally ensure this is escalated to HR and legal within the hour. In the meantime, he turned back to the two employees. As of this moment, your employment is terminated. Please return your badges and step away from the counter. A ripple ran through the terminal, a collective intake of breath from the gathered onlookers. Someone whispered, "They're actually getting fired." Rachel watched as Amanda let out a stunned sob, her fingers fumbling at the clasp of her ID badge. Jason stared ahead blankly, face red with a mix of disbelief and shame. His hands shook as he slid his lanyard from around his neck and dropped it onto the counter with a soft, pathetic clatter. "You don't understand," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "This isn't fair." "Fair," Rachel echoed gently, her eyes never leaving him. Fair would have been treating every passenger with the respect they paid for. Fair would have been answering a simple question without ridicule. But you chose cruelty, and now you're facing the cost of that choice. Amanda clutched her hands to her chest as the security officers motioned gently toward the side hallway. "Please," she whispered, her voice nearly breaking. "Please, I need this job. I wasn't thinking." "Well, that's the problem," Rachel said, her voice still calm but colder now. "You weren't thinking. And people like you do this every day to passengers who never get a chance to defend themselves. I'm not punishing you, I'm holding you accountable." The crowd remained silent, captivated not by spectacle, but by the grace with which Rachel delivered consequence. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't humiliated anyone. But there was no mistaking who held power in this space now. As Amanda and Jason were quietly led away, heads bowed in defeat, the noise of the terminal returned in waves, but softer, more reverent. A few claps broke out, not raucous or performative, but slow and deliberate. A woman in a green scarf nodded silently as Rachel passed. A man in a gray suit gave a small, approving smile, and further back, a young black girl clutched her mother's hand tightly, her eyes wide with admiration. Rachel didn't acknowledge the applause. She didn't bask in it. She simply returned to Mr. Lewis and said, "Now, if we're done here, I'd like to proceed with my upgrade." "Absolutely," Mr. Lewis said, his voice almost reverent. "Seat 1A is yours, and thank you for reminding us what leadership looks like." As she walked toward the gate, her carry-on rolling silently beside her, the truth settled over the room like a calm after the storm. Rachel Monroe had not just walked into that terminal as a passenger. She had walked in as a mirror and shown the company, the staff, and the watching world exactly what happens when quiet power refuses to be dismissed. And if you're still listening now, let her story remind you. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives dressed in grace, walks with poise, and delivers accountability without ever raising its voice. Because real power doesn't need to yell to be heard. It only needs to be seen. As the cabin door sealed behind her with a muted hiss, Rachel Monroe stepped into the sanctuary of first class, not with triumph, but with a quiet, aching stillness that settled deep in her bones. The plush leather seat welcomed her like it knew what she'd just been through, yet even the softest luxury couldn't shield her from the slow-burning ache within. She placed her carry-on gently in the overhead bin and sank into seat 1A, her movements precise, unhurried, like someone too familiar with masking exhaustion in grace. Around her, the cabin buzzed with subtle activity, flight attendants checking compartments, passengers murmuring about connections and dinner choices. But Rachel heard none of it. All she could hear was the echo of Amanda's condescending smirk, Jason's dismissive chuckle, and the bitter clang of assumptions that once again had tried to shrink her down to something she had outgrown long ago. She reached up and adjusted the small reading light above her, more for the ritual than the illumination. and stared out the oval window, where the last rays of afternoon sunlight cast a golden halo over the wing. But even the sky, open and vast, didn't soothe her this time. Because what happened in that terminal, what always happens, wasn't just about being denied a seat upgrade. It was the culmination of a lifetime of being underestimated before a word left her mouth. It was the way their eyes skimmed her without recognition, the way their tone shifted from professional to patronizing the second they saw her skin and assumed a story she never told. And that weight, it was relentless. Rachel knew how to wear elegance like armor. She knew how to speak in a voice so calm it could silence a room. But beneath that mastery, there was fatigue, a tiredness that lived not in her muscles but in her spirit. The kind of tired that came from always being forced to prove she belonged in spaces she had earned, through degrees, through discipline, through decades of battles no one saw. And maybe that's what made today feel heavier than usual. Maybe it was the sheer normalcy of it, how casual the insult had been, how ordinary the prejudice. A simple question, are there any first-class upgrades available, should not have triggered disbelief, laughter, and that stinging, familiar phrase. You people. She had heard it before, in conference rooms, at valet stands, in boutiques where salespeople hovered near her purse but not her questions. You people. The words changed faces, but the implication remained. You don't belong here, and we're surprised you even asked. Rachel turned from the window and exhaled slowly, pressing her back into the seat. The leather was soft, but her chest was tight. She reached for the leather-bound journal in her bag, a habit she had kept for years. It wasn't filled with to-do lists or business strategies. It held moments like this. Raw, honest entries written not for an audience, but for her future self. She opened to a blank page, the paper crisp under her fingers. Her pen hovered in silence, then slowly began to move. Today I was reminded how deeply the world still doubts women who look like me, how quickly our poise is mistaken for arrogance, how easily our confidence is met with suspicion. The ink bled softly into the paper, but the ache in her chest remained. She paused and closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engine settle her thoughts. From the outside, no one could see it. Not the pain, not the fatigue, not the memories that replayed in the quiet corners of her mind. They didn't see the girl she used to be, the girl who had to steel herself to walk into AP classes filled with students who assumed she was lost. The girl who was asked if she was on scholarship the first time she wore a blazer to her Ivy League orientation. The woman who was called too aggressive when she asked for the salary her white male colleague had been offered. Rachel opened her eyes again, now glistening, but unbroken. She looked around the cabin. No one here knew what she had endured to sit in that seat, to claim that space, to hold her ground with nothing but clarity and truth. The flight attendant returned with a tray, offering her a glass of sparkling water with a slice of lemon. "Let me know if there's anything else I can bring you, Miss Monroe," she said with genuine kindness. Rachel nodded, managing a small, polite smile. "Thank you, this is fine." The woman moved on, and Rachel, for the first time that day, allowed herself to breathe, not for survival, but for healing. She brought the glass to her lips and sipped, letting the coolness slide down her throat like a balm against the heat of that terminal moment. In her mind, she could still see Amanda's face fall as Mr. Lewis addressed her. She could still feel the shifting of the crowd, how strangers began to watch not in pity, but in awe. And maybe that's what gave her comfort now, not their downfall, but the fact that someone, maybe even someone who needed to see it, witnessed what quiet power could look like. That respect isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the ability to stand there, unmoved, while someone builds a mountain of assumptions around you, and then watch that mountain crumble in silence. Rachel closed the journal and tucked it away. Her fingers traced the edge of her seatbelt, fastening it with one clean click. The pilot's voice announced a smooth departure ahead, and as the plane began to pull back from the gate, Rachel leaned her head gently against the window and whispered, "You belong." Not as a reminder, as a declaration. Because if you've ever been looked at like you were less than, if you've ever had to earn the same space twice as hard for half the recognition, then let this be your truth too. You belong, full stop. And if you feel that truth in your chest, if this story moved you, click that like button, leave a comment for Rachel, and subscribe to this channel. Because this isn't just her story, it's all of ours. And together we rise, gracefully, powerfully, unapologetically. The plane had been in the air for just under an hour when the first message reached the airline's internal feedback system, submitted anonymously from a passenger seated in row 3C, just behind first class. The note was brief, but unmistakable in tone. I watched something remarkable happen at the gate today. A woman stood her ground with more grace and restraint than I've ever seen. She was mocked, disrespected, and she never once lost her composure. I don't know her name, but she reminded me what quiet power really looks like. That was the first. 5 more would follow before the flight even landed. Another came from a young flight attendant who had only just completed her training. I was on the side of the desk when it all happened, she wrote in her app's private notes. And the way she carried herself, I've never seen someone handle humiliation with that kind of quiet strength. I hope to have that kind of presence one day. And in seat 19A, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Clayton was so moved she jotted Rachel Monroe's name on the back of her boarding pass just to remember it. She reminded me of my sister, she told a nearby passenger. Always calm, always wise. People never saw her coming, but they never forgot her when she left. Rachel, seated in 1A, had no idea what was being said behind her. No idea that the very silence she held like a shield was now echoing through a plane full of witnesses. All she knew was that her shoulders still felt heavy, her breath still came slower than usual, and her soul, despite the resolution, was tired. It was one thing to stand up. It was another thing entirely to do so when your dignity had just been picked apart like a joke. But it was that very stillness, that unwavering composure in the face of mockery that had done something words could not. It had shown everyone watching that strength wasn't measured by volume. It was measured by restraint, by poise, by a refusal to bow to pettiness or prejudice. And that kind of strength, it didn't just command attention, it earned it. Near the back of the plane, a teenage boy traveling with his grandmother had watched the entire scene at the gate unfold from his seat in the waiting area. Too shy to speak up then, he pulled out a sketch pad mid-flight and began to draw. He wasn't good at likenesses yet, but he remembered the way she stood, back straight, hands folded neatly, chin tilted ever so slightly upward. He didn't know her name either, but he titled the sketch Unshaken. And when he got home, he would tape it to the wall above his desk, a reminder that it's possible to stand firm even when the world tries to knock you down. And still, Rachel sat quietly, unaware of the ripple she had caused. Her thoughts were inward now, tracing the long, invisible thread of her life. The childhood days spent watching her mother iron clothes late at night after double shifts. The teachers who second-guessed her intelligence. The bosses who smiled too wide and praised her grace while stealing her ideas. And yet, through it all, she had learned to lead without shouting, to rise without fanfare. She had become a woman who moved like water, steady, clear, unshakable. And that day at the gate, when Amanda and Jason had tried to reduce her with nothing more than a smirk and a whisper, she had reminded the world, without raising her voice, that there is nothing louder than grace under pressure. The pilot's voice crackled overhead. Light turbulence, 15 minutes to descent. Rachel blinked, returning to the moment, and reached for the glass of water beside her. Her fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of restraint she had carried all morning. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. One of the flight attendants, different from the one who greeted her earlier, stood at her side. She looked nervous, but kind. "Excuse me, Ms. Monroe," she said gently. Rachel turned, eyes meeting hers. "Yes?" The young woman straightened. "I just wanted to say, I was there, at the counter. I saw how they treated you, and I just—" Her voice broke for a moment. "You didn't deserve that. And the way you handled it, I'll never forget it." Rachel was silent, stunned by the sincerity in the young woman's voice. The flight attendant pressed on. "I was about to say something when it happened. I wanted to step in, but I froze. I've thought about that every minute since. And I promise, next time, I'll speak." Rachel looked up at her, her own eyes softening. "You're speaking now," she said gently, "and that matters." The young woman's face lit up with gratitude before she nodded and walked away. Rachel exhaled, a small but real smile tugging at her lips. She turned back to the window and watched as the clouds parted to reveal the world below. Maybe no one would remember the names Amanda or Jason. But they'd remember what happened at Gate 23B. They'd remember the woman who stood tall, didn't shout, didn't break, and still left the room changed, because presence is a language. And that day, Rachel Monroe had spoken it fluently. And if you've ever been told you were too quiet, too calm, or not loud enough to lead, remember this: the world doesn't change because we yell the loudest. It changes when we stand still with unshakable dignity and remind it who we are. If this story stirred something in you, if Rachel's grace reminds you of someone you admire or the person you hope to become, click that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Because there are more stories like this, stories that matter, stories that move us, stories that remind us grace changes everything. The phone rang just once before Rachel answered, not because she was expecting the call, but because something inside her knew it was coming. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, unlisted, anonymous, but the hesitation behind it felt deeply familiar. Rachel sat on the edge of her hotel bed, the city lights flickering like distant thoughts across the window behind her. The day had passed in waves, small meetings, quiet stares, a few lingering messages from airline executives still trying to clean up the wreckage Amanda and Jason had left behind. And then came this call. "Hello," Rachel said, her voice steady, warm, but cautious. On the other end, silence stretched thin, then a breath, then a voice, small, uncertain, unfamiliar in its rawness. "Ms. Monroe?" It was Amanda. Gone was the performative cheerfulness or the arrogant tone she'd carried like armor at the airport counter. What remained now was something else entirely: vulnerability, shame, a young woman standing in the rubble of her own decisions. I'm sorry to bother you," Amanda stammered. I just, I know I don't have the right to call you, but I had to trip in." Rachel was silent for a moment, letting the weight of the call settle. She knew this moment wasn't for show. There were no cameras, no passengers, no witnesses. It was just two people, one trying to make sense of her actions, and the other deciding whether to open the door to redemption. "Go ahead," Rachel said softly. Amanda exhaled, a long, shaking sound like someone bracing for impact. "I don't even know where to begin," she whispered. "I've been replaying what happened over and over in my head, the things I said, the way I looked at you, how I laughed. I thought I was just being funny, being clever, but I wasn't. I was cruel. I see that now, and I don't know if it even matters anymore, but I am so, so sorry." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a brief moment, Rachel felt the ghost of that morning return. Not the words Amanda said, but how she said them, the condescension, the confidence in her judgment, the way she'd wielded superiority without question. But now that voice was gone, and in its place was someone afraid of who she had been, hoping she wasn't stuck there forever. "Amanda," Rachel said gently, "this isn't an easy conversation to have, but I'm listening." Amanda's breath hitched. "Thank you. I didn't expect you to pick up. I wouldn't have blamed you if you didn't." She paused, then continued, her words spilling out now like water through a broken dam. "When Mr. Lewis showed up and you stepped forward and he said your name, I've never felt so sick. Not just because I realized who you were, but because I realized what I had done. I didn't just insult a customer. I tried to humiliate a woman who had done nothing wrong. I saw your skin, your quietness, and I assumed you didn't belong. And I hate that about myself. I hate that I didn't even think twice." Rachel closed her eyes, letting the words sink in, not because they were easy to hear, but because they were necessary. She thought of the countless times she had wished for this, for someone to see what they had done, without needing her to spell it out. She didn't need Amanda's shame, but she valued her recognition. "I'm not calling for forgiveness," Amanda said, her voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve that, but I want to change. I need to. I don't want to be the kind of person who keeps making people feel small." For a moment, Rachel sat in the quiet, the line open, the air thick with something unspoken. And then she spoke, not with judgment, not with bitterness, but with the kind of clarity that only comes from experience. "Amanda," she said softly, "do you know how many times I've been in your presence before? Not you personally, but people like you. Who dismissed me before I spoke? Who laughed before they asked? Who decided I didn't belong before they even knew my name? Amanda didn't answer. She didn't have to. Rachel continued, I've spent my whole life proving myself in rooms that weren't built for me. And sometimes the worst part isn't the insult. It's how normal it feels to everyone else. You didn't just hurt me, Amanda. You reminded everyone watching that this still happens. Every day. And most of the time, people like me don't get the chance to respond. There was silence again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of truth, of ache, of a reckoning Amanda had never seen coming. I understand, Amanda whispered. I understand now. Rachel shook her head gently, not with disagreement, but with realism. Understanding is a beginning, she said. But now you have to ask yourself, what will you do with it? Amanda inhaled shakily. I've already reached out to HR. I asked to be enrolled in their training program for internal bias. I know that's just the start, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. And not because I want my job back. I don't expect that. I just want to be better. Rachel's chest tightened, not because she was moved by Amanda's redemption, but because she knew how rare it was to hear someone take real responsibility. And still, she didn't rush to embrace her. Growth wasn't instant, trust wasn't automatic. But grace, it could be extended. If you mean that, Rachel said quietly, then do the work. And don't do it for me. Do it for every woman who stood at that counter and didn't have a voice. Amanda's voice broke again. I will. I promise. Rachel nodded, the edges of her voice softening. Then maybe this moment can be your turning point. The call ended without ceremony, just a quiet goodbye, and the heavy, hopeful silence that follows when someone chooses to change. And as Rachel sat back, phone resting in her palm, she felt a stillness settle around her. Not relief, not closure, but something better. A door opened, a seed planted, a reminder that even in moments of humiliation, healing could begin. And maybe that's why this story matters, because it's not just about punishment, it's about possibility. If this moment moved you, if you believe in second chances earned through truth, not shortcuts, like this story, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what real growth looks like. Because accountability and grace, that's where change begins. In the weeks that followed the incident at Gate 23B, the shockwaves of Rachel Monroe's quiet confrontation spread far beyond the polished marble floors of that terminal. What had begun as a humiliating encounter, just another moment in a long, invisible chain of dismissals, had ignited something deeper, something systemic. Because this time, the story hadn't ended with an apology and a glass of complimentary champagne. This time, there had been consequences, real ones. Amanda and Jason's public terminations had made headlines in industry forums, and passengers had begun to talk, first in whispers, then in full-throated conversation. Social media caught wind of the incident when a bystander posted a vague but powerful tweet. I watched a black woman get mocked at an airport counter today. 10 minutes later, she owned the room. Literally. That kind of grace, that kind of strength, I'll never forget it. The post went viral. People wanted to know more. And when they learned her name, Rachel Monroe, many discovered she wasn't just a high-ranking consultant in equity and culture development. She was one of the foremost minds in the field, a strategist whose quiet fingerprints had been behind more than a dozen corporate transformations across industries. But this time, she hadn't come in through the boardroom. She had walked in through the front door, alone, tired, asking for a simple upgrade, and been met with laughter. That irony struck people hard enough to shake leadership awake. Within 48 hours, the airline's CEO personally requested a meeting with Rachel. It wasn't just about PR. It was about survival. He didn't want this moment to become a symbol of everything his company had failed to fix. Rachel agreed to meet, but on her terms. She arrived at headquarters in a simple gray suit and low heels, her journal tucked in her bag, and a folder of proposals she hadn't written for them but knew they'd need. The CEO, David Halbridge, greeted her with awkward reverence, clearly aware of the imbalance. I want to start by saying we're deeply sorry for what happened, he said, gesturing toward a sleek boardroom that still smelled faintly of catered coffee and panic. That kind of treatment is unacceptable, and it does not reflect our values. Rachel looked at him calmly, then sat down. But it does, she said gently. It reflects your culture. Maybe not your mission statement, but certainly your day-to-day environment. Her words didn't sting with blame. They landed with clarity. And David didn't argue. He couldn't. Because when a woman calmly dismantles your illusions with nothing but truth, there's nowhere to hide. Over the next 2 hours, Rachel laid out a plan, not just for bias training, but for cultural recalibration. You don't have a training problem, she told them. You have a values application problem. Your employees are absorbing the message that some passengers deserve more dignity than others. And unless you rewire what excellence means here, that message won't change. The board listened, most of them silent. A few scribbled notes furiously, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to with such directness. But no one interrupted, because Rachel's words weren't aggressive, they were undeniable. Within the week, her suggestions were implemented into a new company-wide initiative, Project Elevate, a multi-phase transformation focused on equity, empathy, and human-centered service. All staff, from gate agents to executives, would be required to undergo immersive training, not once but quarterly. Leadership was mandated to spend hours each month on the ground, interacting directly with passengers, logging first-hand observations, and facing the culture they claimed to manage. But Rachel didn't stop there. She worked with HR to establish an anonymous reporting system for both passengers and employees to document incidents of discrimination, no matter how subtle. She ensured that employees who did speak up, people like the nervous young flight attendant who approached her in first class to say, "You reminded me of who I want to become," had clear, safe channels for voicing concerns without fear of retaliation. And most importantly, Rachel insisted on transparency. Each quarter, the airline would publish an internal culture report outlining not just numbers, but stories. Stories of passengers who were treated with exceptional dignity, and stories of when the system failed and what was done to fix it. But perhaps the most emotionally moving change came from Rachel's personal suggestion to start a mentorship initiative within the airline called Wings of Worth, a voluntary program pairing veteran employees with newer ones to foster deeper understanding across lines of race, class, and role. Bias grows in silence, she said. Empathy grows in conversation. And so it began. And across terminals and lounges and baggage claim counters, people started talking. A gate agent named Miguel wrote in a staff blog post that the first time he sat in on the new workshops, he cried. Not because of guilt, but because for the first time, he realized how often he had judged someone by their clothes, their accent, their posture. "I thought I was being efficient," he wrote, "but what I was being was cold." Meanwhile, Rachel stayed behind the scenes, not seeking headlines, not chasing recognition. But her impact spoke for her. Passenger reviews improved dramatically. Incidents of reported discrimination dropped by more than 60% in 3 months. And in one particularly moving moment, a grandmother wrote to the airline after her autistic grandson was treated with patience and empathy by a newly trained employee. "He wasn't rushed," she wrote. "He was seen." And still, Rachel knew the work wasn't done. In a quiet moment alone, sitting in a terminal overlooking the runway, she pulled out her journal and wrote, "Change doesn't start with shouting. It starts when someone sees the fire and chooses to carry light instead of throwing fuel. I didn't come here to burn things down. I came here to rebuild what never should have been broken." That's who Rachel Monroe was. Not a viral moment, not a hero by accident. She was a force of intentionality. A woman who walked into a moment of injustice and chose to use it, not for revenge, but for renewal. And if you're still listening, if you're someone who's ever been overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel invisible, remember this. Sometimes the quietest confrontation becomes the loudest legacy. Rachel didn't just change a policy, she changed a culture. And if that moves you, like this story, comment below to share what it meant to you, and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. Stories of justice, transformation, and the quiet power that rewrites the world. Because change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and still, it changes everything. The terminal was buzzing as usual, people dragging suitcases, announcements murmuring overhead, gate attendants shuffling boarding passes with half-practiced smiles. But to Rachel Monroe, it all sounded muted, like background noise behind the steady hum of something deeper. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the polished floor as she made her way toward the exit, her carry-on rolling beside her with effortless grace. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered the storm and still stood tall, not untouched, but unshaken. Heads turned as she passed, not with overt recognition, but with something quieter, almost reverent. Strangers who had watched her confrontation hours earlier now looked on with subtle nods of respect, their curiosity replaced by awareness. But Rachel didn't look around for applause. She didn't walk for validation. She walked with purpose because she knew every step mattered. Not just for her, but for those watching who didn't yet have the words to explain why her presence made them feel seen. And then, as she passed a row of seats near the large floor-to-ceiling windows, she saw her. A little black girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting beside her mother, her small legs swinging just above the floor. Her hair was done in tight braids, with pink beads that clicked softly as she turned her head. But it was her eyes that caught Rachel. Wide, unblinking, filled with something that stopped Rachel mid-step. Wonder, admiration, recognition. The little girl stared at her, not like she was a celebrity, but like she was a glimpse of a future she hadn't yet dared to imagine. Rachel offered her a small, warm smile, the kind that says, "I see you." And the girl smiled back, shy but radiant, as if the moment had lit something inside her. Rachel glanced at the mother, who gave a soft nod of gratitude, her eyes misted with unshed tears. No words passed between them, but none were needed. The mother held her daughter's hand a little tighter, and Rachel felt something shift inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. Not relief, not victory, but the profound ache of knowing that, in this moment, her pain had planted a seed of possibility in someone else. She turned and walked on, but her heart stayed behind with that little girl, because she knew what it meant to be that girl. She remembered being 10, standing in line at an airport with her grandmother, wearing her best church dress for her first flight, only to be asked if they were lost. She remembered the sting in her grandmother's voice when she replied, "No, we know exactly where we're going." She remembered how long it took to believe that was true. And now, here she was, Rachel Monroe, strategist, speaker, cultural architect, walking through that same airport, not as a passenger waiting to be accepted, but as a woman who had demanded accountability and changed the game. And the beauty of it, the ache and the wonder of it, was that the little girl watching her might never know the details of what happened at Gate 23B. She wouldn't know about Amanda's smirk or Jason's condescension, or the way Rachel had to fight, again, for the right to be treated with basic respect. But what that girl would know, somewhere deep in her soul, was that she had seen a black woman walk through the terminal like she belonged. Not tentatively, not apologetically, but fully, completely, and without fear. And that image, that example, was enough to change the trajectory of her belief in what was possible. Rachel continued walking, but her throat tightened with emotion. It wasn't just about her anymore. It never really had been. All those moments of being overlooked, talked over, dismissed, they had been preparing her for this. Not so she could collect wins like trophies, but so she could make space, real space, space for others to breathe a little easier, to stand a little taller, to ask for that upgrade, that opportunity, that respect, and know they had a right to it. She paused briefly at the escalator, her eyes catching a reflection in the chrome rail. Her own face stared back, composed, powerful, beautiful. But she also saw the reflection of others layered behind her. Her mother, her grandmother, mentors who had poured into her, interns she had coached, the young professionals who had DM'd her late at night after seeing her speak, saying, "You make me feel like I can do this too." Rachel blinked back, the emotion welling in her chest, and took a deep breath. She had thought the fight today was for dignity, for fairness, for justice, and it was. But standing here on the other side of it, she realized it was also about inheritance, about what we leave behind, not in plaques or paychecks, but in the hearts of those who watch us and think, maybe I can too. The airport's automatic doors opened ahead, and the crisp evening air met her like a gentle exhale. A car pulled up, a black sedan with tinted windows. The driver stepped out and opened the door with a respectful ease. Rachel nodded a quiet thank you and slid into the back seat, her bag beside her. As the city lights blurred past the window, her mind returned to that little girl, those big, curious eyes, and she thought about what she would say if they ever met again years from now. Maybe she'd tell her, keep walking, even when they try to stop you. Keep rising, even when they want you to shrink. And never forget, the quiet power you carry is enough to move mountains. But for now, Rachel simply closed her eyes and let the silence surround her. Not the silence of dismissal, but the kind earned by standing firm. And if you've ever been underestimated, ever been told you don't fit, let her story remind you, you belong. You always did. And if Rachel's strength reached you, like this story, comment below to honor the people who've made you feel seen. And subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. Because someone somewhere is watching you too. Let them see what power looks like. Let them hope. The sun dipped low behind the horizon as Rachel Monroe sat by the window of her hotel suite, a steaming cup of tea cupped gently in her hands, and her journal resting open on the table beside her. The city skyline stretched out before her, glittering in the twilight, but her gaze was somewhere far beyond it. The events of the past day had finally slowed into stillness, and for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to exhale. Not because the moment demanded it, but because her spirit needed the space. She had walked through fire that morning, not with anger or theatrics, but with the quiet force of someone who knew who she was and refused to be reduced. And now, in the aftermath, as the adrenaline faded and the soft weight of reflection settled over her, she found herself staring out into the night, not with weariness, but with gratitude. Because in that one humiliating moment at the airport counter, she had been reminded of something she'd carried with her all along. Grace is strength, and strength is grace. Rachel reached for her journal, its leather cover worn smooth from years of use, and turned to a fresh page. She clicked her pen slowly, then began to write. Not for the world, not for a headline, but for herself. Today I was tested, not by conflict, but by assumption. I was reminded that even after all I've built, all I've proven, there are still those who will look at me and see only what they choose. But I was also reminded of something deeper. That dignity does not waver when it's real. That silence can speak louder than rage. And that the ripples we create, even in moments of pain, can become waves we never fully see. She paused, letting the ink settle into the page, then smiled softly. I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I only needed to stand in truth. Her phone buzzed nearby with a new message. It was from the same young flight attendant who had quietly approached her mid-flight, the one who had whispered, I saw what happened. I'll never forget it. The message was simple. You changed something in me today. Thank you for showing us how to lead. Rachel's eyes welled unexpectedly, and she pressed a hand gently to her heart. She hadn't done it for recognition. She hadn't done it to be admired. She had done it because someone had to, because too many people had been silent too long, because respect should never be conditional, and dignity should never depend on the zip code of your appearance. As the city outside blinked into evening, Rachel thought back to the little girl in the airport terminal, the one with the bright eyes and beaded braids, who had looked at her like she was a story waiting to be told. That girl didn't know her resume. She didn't know her salary, her achievements, or the countless doors Rachel had walked through alone. But what she did know, what she felt, was that she had seen someone who walked like she belonged. And that image, that one unspoken moment, that might live in her forever. Rachel smiled wider now, the kind of smile that stretches from the soul, and closed her journal. Because she knew this wasn't just the end of a bad day. This was the beginning of something better. Not just for her, for everyone who watched, for everyone who's ever been talked over, laughed at, or looked past. This was a reminder to them. You don't need to shout to be powerful. You don't need to match arrogance with noise. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is simply stand your ground and let the silence reveal the truth. And so, as Rachel turned off the lights and let the calm wash over her, a new kind of joy bloomed in her chest. Not the loud, fleeting joy of revenge, but the quiet, lasting joy of reclamation. She had taken back her space. She had taken back the narrative. and she had done it with poise, purpose, and peace. And if you're still listening, if this story touched something deep in you, then here's what Rachel would want you to remember. Never judge someone by what you see at first glance. Strength isn't always loud. Power doesn't always wear a suit or carry a title. And dignity, that lives in how we treat one another when no one's watching. If you're someone who's ever been told you're not enough because of your voice, your skin, your silence, let Rachel's story remind you that you are more than enough. You belong in every room, in every space, on every stage, and not because someone gives you permission, but because you decide to claim it. And if you're someone who's watching others from the sidelines, wondering how you can help, start here. Start by listening, start by seeing, and most importantly, start by believing. Rachel didn't ask for a platform that day. She didn't walk into the terminal hoping to make a statement, but when the world gave her an insult, she gave it back a lesson. And that lesson, it lives on. Not just in policies changed or staff retrained, it lives in the little girl watching, in the passengers whispering, "Did you see that?" In the employee who wrote to say, "I want to be better." It lives in every ripple, and every ripple becomes a wave. So if this story meant something to you, if you felt seen, inspired, or reminded of your own strength, please take a moment to like this story. Leave a comment below to support Rachel and everyone who has walked a similar road. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more real, powerful stories that honor dignity, resilience, and transformation. Because here we believe that storytelling isn't just about entertainment. It's about empathy. It's about change. And it's about reminding each other that the smallest act of grace can shape the world.